Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Training in Science Policy Memoranda Workshop. My name is Paige Greenwood, and I am a fifth-year neuroscience doctoral candidate at the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine, and I am the co-chair of the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine Science Policy Group, and we're really excited to be here with some really awesome speakers. And also being able to get some experience in science policy writing. So our first speaker is Dr. Cristin Dorgelo, who is the president and CEO at the Association of Science and Technology Centers. ASTC is a network of nearly 700 science and technology centers and museums, as well as other allied science engagement organizations focused on increasing public understanding of and engagement with science and technology among all people. She previously served as Chief of Staff at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy during the Obama administration, facilitating policy development across a wide range of science and technology issues. At OSTP, she led a White House initiative to increase the number of individual organizations and federal agencies pursuing grand challenges, audacious yet achievable goals that harness science and technology to solve global and national problems. She also led efforts to increase federal agency use of open innovation approaches, incentive prizes to engage citizen solvers on challenge.gov, an effort that won Harvard Ash Center's Innovation in American Government Award in 2013. Prior to serving at OSTP, she led groundbreaking technology competitions at X Prize Foundation. She's also a proud alumni of UCLA and a UCLA Bruin. So thank you so much, Dr. Dorgelo, for being here today, and we are really excited to hear from you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Paige. And no doctor needed. I myself am not a PhD like many of you are on the road to be or may already be, and it's really fantastic to be with all of you today, a topic after my own heart. Are you ready for me to get started, Paige?
Absolutely.
Yeah, great. So fantastic. So I want to offer a few reflections on my own experience in policy, serving at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy as a little context for where policy memos can fit in terms of the policy making process and why it's so important to work on the approach that we all take to refining our policy memos together. And so I'm super excited to be with all of you who are interested in this topic, potentially interested in policy careers, and happy as we move along to take questions. And I know we're going to save some time at the back end of this for questions, but I'm also happy if you have questions as I go, if you want to drop those into the chat. I will keep an eye on that a bit, and others may, and I'm happy to try to get at questions as we move. So let me go ahead and share my presentation. So, you know, when Paige mentioned that I'm a UCLA Bruin, and I actually spent a lot of my initial policy career in California, and I had been working in incentive prizes at the X Prize Foundation, and the federal government was starting to think about how they could advance more open innovation work, how federal agencies could open up the challenges that they were facing to more citizens across the country, to more entrepreneurs across the country. So a guy named Tom Khalil, who I had been working with, who was one of the senior leaders at the Office of Science and Technology Policy, gave me a ring one day and said, how would you feel about serving your country? And it turns out it's really hard to say no when you're given an opportunity to do that. And so I was able to move across the country to DC to join this amazing team, which was the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the Obama administration. You can tell we had a lot of fun together. It was a team of about, depending on the time, 130 to 150 policy experts. They came from a lot of diverse backgrounds. Some of them were scientists and technologists. Some of them were lawyers. Some of them came up through a policy environment, And that mix of backgrounds was really terrific. We had entrepreneurs at the table and the like. And one thing that we tried to do was be really intentional about learning from each other in terms of what the approaches to policy were that were effective, what were some of the creative ways that our colleagues were making change in the world. I think a lot of us might have come to the White House with this idea that all of our days were going to look like this, that we were going to be in very serious meetings, occasionally in the Oval Office, offering advice to the president on very important matters of science and technology policy. And that was certainly occasionally the case, and there was lots of memo writing. But one thing I wanted to say at the top, before we even get into talking about policy memos, is that I think a lot of us were surprised about how many of our days actually looked like this. So in fact, we had a whole lot of events that we used to advance policy. We had a whole lot of communications activities that we used to advance policy. And many of the scientists and technologists and engineers who came to serve at White House OSTP would reflect to me that they were surprised how important communication was, how absolutely core to our activities that was. Whether it was throwing the White House Science Fair, in which we, like the White House Maker Fair, moved the furniture out of the White House and brought a lot of amazing young scientists, engineers, entrepreneurs to demonstrate what they were capable of to the president as a way to move forward a huge amount of policy work, both with federal agencies and with partners on the outside. Whether it was the White House Frontiers Conference, a massive convening that we did in 2016 at Carnegie Mellon University, where President Obama not only fist bumped a robotic hand, as you can see there in the center, which the patient was able to feel. You should definitely look up that fist bump moment. It was crazy cool. Or he was able to check out the Dragon capsule there, which, as the space nerds on the line may know, just successfully brought American astronauts to the space station and back. Or whether it was the White House's first Google Hangout series called We the Geeks. Communication became a very big part of my policy life. So some of that went into very effective policy memos, and sometimes it went around convenings, around how we communicated with the public, what our priorities were, and why they would matter to the public. So I wanted to note at the top that if you're really focused on sharpening your communication skills, there's a great reason for that in the policy environment, and you will put it to good work. I will also say, if you get a chance to engage in significant opportunities to plan events, you will put that to good work in your policy environment too. So to Paige and others who are helping to organize today's events, those event management skills will come in handy. So I realized that one of the things that has stuck with me most about my time at OSTP had to do with aspiration. It had to do with what I believed was fixed and what I believed was changeable about the world around me. This is a quote from my boss, Tom Khalil, who brought me into OSTP, that really sat with me, which is that we walk around this world with a sense of what the walls are around us. And a lot of times we assume those walls can't be changed. And really, policy work is about understanding that most of the status quo is the result of human action or inaction. So we can change it. And that's really what policy work is all about. So when we would come onto this team at OSTP and we brought new folks aboard, we would often, especially Tom, ask those new team members a question, which was, if you had 15 minutes with the president, and in this case, since we have an election coming up, I'm going to ask you if you had 15 minutes with a new president-elect or a newly re-elected incumbent president, what's the one thing you would ask them to do or to change or not to do related to science, technology, and innovation? Knowing the answer to that question, your top priority, your passion, your mission in the world is going to be one of the most important parts of a career in policy. Because it might take you years to move the needle on that idea. It might move pretty quickly, but knowing with clarity what change it is you're trying to drive in the world is particularly powerful when you get into a career in policy. So before we talk about a memo, I want to talk about what goes into it, which are ideas. So the first part that we often skip, because sometimes we have sort of a pet idea, a pet rock that we would love to have exist, we sometimes forget to communicate the why. So why is it a big deal? Why should your audience, in this case, in this thought experiment, the President of the United States, be excited about it? Why, especially politically, is it worth highlighting now? One thing that's often a challenge for scientists and engineers as they transition to service in government is that political sense of what else is going around us? What would the benefits be to advancing this idea at this time versus later on down the road? And really humanizing our work. What is it about this change we would like to see in the world, this area of science or research or innovation that we want to advance, that really should be meaningful to the American people, that would result in nationwide or global impact? So not just telling the story of what the change is, but why the change will matter to the American people. And I think we can't leave out right now a conversation about whether the change that we are proposing advances equity, inclusion, and social justice or not, and being really intentional about that. And we have a part to play in that in the science and technology community as well. I think that one of the other reasons we need to get our why story down is to talk about why now. One of the things that would happen at OSTP is we would occasionally propose new national research initiatives, like, for example, the BRAIN initiative, in which we looked at the intersection of nanotechnology and neurotechnology to see that there was an opportunity on the horizon to develop new neurotechnologies that would help us understand the function of the dynamic human brain. This was a huge opportunity, but to convince the rest of the administration, to convince Congress, to convince philanthropists that that was something to pursue now, we had to have our ideas straight about why now. What was it about developments in science? What was it about convergence research? What was it about what we thought was on the horizon of scientific breakthroughs that made it a good idea to try to pursue the BRAIN initiative now? You could make the same case today about research into aging, that there are breakthroughs on the horizon that are possible now because the state of developments in science that weren't necessarily possible a few years back. We're going to talk a little bit more today about how and what. So one thing that is very common early in policy careers when we had people coming new into OSTP is that they were able to describe the problem, but they were not necessarily able to describe what needed to happen to make progress. And so really focusing on developing your sense of the policy toolkit will allow you to be more creative about, in these policy memos, what types of interventions are you suggesting? What types of actions are you suggesting? And how specific are you getting about those actions? I think part of this process that we'll talk about in the policy memo development process is about making it easy for other people to come along with your idea. We're going to come back to that. I think the part about, a lot of the structures in the world around us being made by people, it didn't just happen. It's not just a law of physics thing. Sometimes gets forgotten about when we're developing our policy ideas. We need to think very specifically about who needs to be at the table. Certainly, we spend a lot of time talking about bringing more scientists and engineers around the table. We certainly talk about being more inclusive about who is at the table in terms of their background, in terms of their racial or ethnic identity, in terms of their gender identity. But it's not just that. Which federal agencies, which state and local agencies, who in the private sector or philanthropic sectors could be called to action? Who should do what? It's not always clear exactly which federal agency should be the lead on something, and really thinking intentionally about that. And then policy ends up existing in a political environment. So it's hard to escape the need to build a base of support. So one thing that you'll cover in policy memos is who does and who doesn't support an idea, and being realistic about the base of support you need to develop in order to pull off that idea. Okay, we've been talking a lot about policy. Maybe we should be transparent about what my policy definition is that we're using to ground this. I'm not using Merriam-Webster's definition. I'm also not using Wikipedia's definition, although I think they're certainly valid. I think I'm speaking a little more generally here. And one of the resources that is actually linked from the NSPN policy competition website is this particular piece on how to write a health policy brief. And I love this definition that sits in there, which is movement in a direction for a reason, right? I think we think often about policy as a piece of paper. We think about policy as something that got written down. But really it is about being intentional about the movement we want to see and why we want to see it. And so that's the definition that I'm using going into this conversation. So when I came to the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, we were just in the middle of moving the office from something that's called the new Executive Office Building. If you go to DC, it's sort of up the road from the White House, to the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, or sometimes called the old Executive Office Building. And I got put in this office on the 4th floor with a guy named Kumar Garg, who will be a lifetime friend. And we had this whiteboard in our office, and Kumar is a big supporter and an engaged member of the NSPN community. And Kumar started writing down some of the observations that our boss, Tom Palil, had, that our colleagues had at OSTP, about what it took to be a policy entrepreneur. What do I mean by a policy entrepreneur? I'm referring here to this definition of entrepreneurship as the pursuit of opportunity without regard to resources currently controlled. There's an optimism in that. There's a desire to make change that is bigger than what you yourself alone control. And there are strategies that make that possible. And every single one of those strategies is usually necessary in order to land the ideas in whatever policy memo you write. And so what I'm talking about here is really where you start. So well before you put pen to paper, you need to start thinking about what we just talked about. What is the end you are driving toward? What is the vision that you are shooting for? And having a conversation, not just with yourself, but with a lot of other people about how might we pull that off? Because there's almost never one pathway to that end. There are a lot of pathways to that end. You know, one of the other things that we observed was the importance of, once we knew our idea, writing it down in multiple formats. I cannot express to you how important that is. We're going to talk today specifically about policy memos. But I also always had in my back pocket a paragraph level description of my idea, which meant that I could drop it into somebody else's policy memo. I always had a 1-sentence version of that. I had the thing I would love the president to say in a speech. And by the way, you're almost never going to get a whole speech. So what's the sentence you would love for him to build into a speech, or at some point in the future, her? You know, what is it that it would be if it was printed on one piece of paper and handed out at a meeting? So being ready to do that table drop of your idea to those that you're trying to engage. And then most certainly working toward the policy memo that really captures the details of the concepts. So I can't encourage you to do that enough. Please don't just write long policy memos. Please also think about how to express your idea in a paragraph and in a sentence. And that brevity will really be helpful. Some of the other things that we would talk about often was finding our doers. What do we mean by that? Well, when we're trying to change the policy direction of a national level issue, we need help. We need to know if there are people within the agencies, within the organizations that we're trying to move, who will help us pull off the change. They can often make our policy ideas more refined. They can do a lot of footwork, and they can allow us to make more progress than we could alone. So really find that group of compatriots that wants to see the same change as you. And maybe they had the idea long before you did. That's certainly possible. The other thing I wanted to ask us to think about is how we really need to seek input. I know that for some of us, seeking input feels like it slows down the process of developing ideas. And usually it does, but it does more than that. It makes the ideas a whole lot better. It really, really improves the end product. And sometimes there might be conflict in that input process. People might disagree with what you're proposing. I was relatively conflict averse earlier in my career. And now I know that having that tussle, that tension, is actually tremendously productive, especially if you realize that it's done with the best intentions of the country or the world at heart. I say here, seek input, lots of input at the right times. What do I mean by that? At the right times, meaning that sometimes it might not be the right time to raise your idea. So you got to read the room. You got to read the state of the country, and maybe others aren't quite ready for your big picture yet. So do use some common sense about when you seek that input. You don't want to have your idea tanked too early by someone else who has more power than you. You really want to have that judgment about seeking lots of input, but at the right time. You know, you might have been, while I've been talking, looking at some of the additional sayings here on this whiteboard, and I'm more than happy when we get to questions to defining any of these for you, in case anything is sparking for you as something you want to talk about more. I would call out one more before I move on, which is water on stone. Sometimes one of my colleagues at OSTP would come back and say, "It finally happened. I got this agency head to say yes to this idea," or "the president is actually going to say my idea in the speech next week," or the like. And a lot of policy work can feel like it moves slowly. And so be patient like that. Erode away like water on stone resistance to your idea, and just hold that out. So we'll come back to this. So, you know, policy toolkit. I mentioned that so many of us think about policy as this piece of paper that is our end goal. And it's really not. It's really that movement in a direction for a reason. And so often when we think first about our policy toolkit, we're thinking about these blunt objects by which we can make movement happen, especially if we're thinking about policy at the federal level or in the executive branch of the government. We think about the blunt object, let us make people do something. That might be working with Congress on law, giving new authorities to agencies. That might be the executive actions under a president's control, be they executive orders or memorandums. They might be regulation in which we are making industry or other actors do something a certain way or setting standards or codes. They might be that formal agreement between countries. They might be the way in which we create or blow up organizations. They might be the way in which we know a law is moving and we get our idea added into that law. They might be a really blunt reversal. The last president did this, this president is going to do this. But those blunt objects are really reserved for where we can't get movement done another way, right? We can't convince our actors to move in that direction without making them do it. And so I want to make sure that as you're thinking about your policy memo ideas, you're also thinking about a few other ways to encourage movement to happen. So we can incentivize movement. We can pay for it through budget. We can increase the budget for research and development. We can contract for it. We can actually have federal agencies ask for it to be built and put out a request for proposal. I mentioned that I worked in incentive prizes. We can literally put out a problem statement to the world and say, if you solve it, we will pay you this much money. We can think about the way in which government is a customer. just by what government buys, it can change what the market offers. Government is a really big customer. We can be thinking about deregulation as an incentive, or sandboxes where companies can play with new approaches to how technology is integrated into society, or experimental sites that allow us to really think about education differently than we might in another environment. We also can be thinking about the people who are incentivized to do certain work. So in the bottom there, you see a line that talks about talent pipeline and tours of duty. What are the roles that exist in government? And just by changing those roles, you can incentivize people to fill the roles and therefore focus on a problem. So what jobs exist? President Obama came in and created the US Chief Technology Officer. We didn't have one before. All of a sudden, we're doing a whole body of work related to applying technologies to some of the nation and the world's hardest problems. There are processes for managing agency performance. So what goals are set for federal agencies and how do we manage their performance? So please also think about incentives, not just blunt objects, to make people do something. One thing that we played with a lot when we were doing things like the White House Science Fair or the White House Maker Fair or the White House Frontiers Conference, we weren't just throwing a cool party. We weren't just making a powerful conference and bringing interesting people around a table. We were using those events, that convening power, that bully pulpit that the president has to deliver speeches, as a way to call for movement from others, to make a goal so inspiring that people were willing to commit resources to it, that the private sector, that philanthropy, that individuals were willing to say, I will do something. And it didn't require any money. It did, well, probably a little bit. It didn't require any law. It simply required a compelling call. And we often miss that part, that good leaders are able to call for movement. And that might be the soft signal of an agency putting out a request for information, which all of a sudden makes people say, ooh, maybe we care about that idea now. Or convening, like the events I talked about, in which we would, for months ahead of time, build commitments from the private sector, from federal agencies, so that we would issue a fact sheet filled with hundreds of millions of dollars of commitments, just empowered by the idea. Or I worked on grand challenges. The president and vice president saying, now is the time for us to make progress on cancer because of the following. Are you with us? Moved mountains. So please also think about that convening power of government. One last point on this policy toolkit. And for some of you, this might feel boring, but I gotta tell you, it was probably the most important set of actions that I learned about in my time at OSTP, which is setting up the infrastructure for support for movement. Just creating a community of practice among federal professionals interested in something new. It's so hard to be on the edge of some change, right? So if you can give support to the federal agency staff and personnel that are trying to drive change, change will happen faster. Whether it's giving them a community of their peers, a community of practice to work within, whether it's thinking about government itself as a platform, as Tim O'Reilly has often talked about, where we actually can open up the assets of government, like data, like facilities, like our algorithms, like our intellectual property, to allow change to happen among entrepreneurs across the country. That's a support system. When we think about evidence, and do we have enough evidence for why a certain policy change is needed or not? Just investing in building that evidence base can be an important support. I know that sometimes committees and councils and commissions sound boring, but it is amazing how powerful their reports can be in driving change. So I am always entertained by how often now I see, let us create a new commission to create a report. That can actually be pretty powerful. So don't forget those support systems that are needed too. So again, we can come back to this as we get to questions, but please think about if there's any whiteboard sayings here that you want to dig into as we move into questions and answers. Okay, so this is a policy memo writing workshop, so we should talk about policy memos. I know you're going to get into the fundamentals and really get into the weeds of what type of memo you are writing. But you know, one thing I learned when I became chief of staff at White House OSTP is there are a lot of different kinds of memos, and every single one of them should be used for what this red text says at the bottom. This is again linked from that how to write a health policy brief. Whether you're writing an event memo or a background memo or a decision memo, you should be thinking about using it as a chance to talk about the action you're trying to drive, right? If there's any time you're writing, you are trying to make the case for your idea. And there are, in the White House context, a whole lot of different memo types. You might be answering the question of the president or of the principal, of the agency head. You might be writing an event memo that prepares the principal or prepares the president for an event in which you are giving them background and encouragement of how to make the most of that event. You might be, and this will show up in a lot of what you are writing, making a recommendation, offering options. And it is not unheard of to be offering a split view recommendation. We like to avoid that. We like to prefer to give the president a unified view of what his or her or their advisors think is the right way to go. But sometimes you can't get to the consensus, and the idea is hard enough that you need to offer a split view. You might be asking the president to make a decision or the principal to make a decision, or you might not be ready for that yet. You might say, you know, Mr. President, we are working through these options and we're going to get back to you with our recommendation. We're not there yet. You might be offering a progress report or a status update because presidents also like to know whether the thing they asked to happen has happened. So that also occurs pretty regularly. One thing that I sort of undervalued until I became the chief of staff at our office were the standing annual processes in which we were only one part of a moving set of gears. So what do I mean by that? Every single year, the executive branch prepares a budget proposal. There are many ideas that go into what should be in that budget proposal, and being ready for that process in any given year was really important for us. Also, it was really important for us to prepare for the State of the Union. I know it's a speech, but you should see the paragraphs upon paragraphs about policy ideas that go into preparing for that speech, because it becomes a place where the president rolls out their agenda. And so that BRAIN initiative that I mentioned earlier, this idea of nanotechnology and neurotechnology and neuroscience coming together to develop new neurotechnologies to understand the dynamic human brain, that really got its start from a powerful paragraph backed up with a great policy memo that essentially went into State of the Union planning, and the president said less than a sentence about the potential to understand the human brain. And that less than a sentence phrase ended up a few months later turning into a full launch of the BRAIN initiative, which continues now with billions of dollars committed to it. So don't underestimate the power of having a paragraph that is compelling. Please, please. It's so important. So that's important to know what type of memo you're writing. I will say, having worked with the President's Science Advisor, Dr. John P. Holdren, you can find his How to Avoid Common Pitfalls in Professional Writing on the NSPN policy competition website. I was super happy to see it there. I want to say a couple of things about how important it is to write clearly. And one thing that, especially with complicated science and technology topics, we find in policy memos is that there is a natural tension between writing so that you can be understood and writing so you can't be misunderstood. So like pause on that for a second. If you write very simply and plainly, that will help you get away from jargon and communicate your idea to those that do not sit in science every day. So simple and plain is good. But Dr. Holdren would often read a memo and say, whoo, that we have left out the core here. This quote here from him, that simplicity and economy are only assets if they help rather than hurt logic and clarity. That simplicity or economy in writing at the expense of clarity, meaning that you could be misunderstood, is false economy. And working with him and our OSTP staff on that balance became really important, because you all are interested in science and technology policy. We have to communicate facts. We can't be misunderstood. We need to make sure the president is making decisions from the best science. And so I have to sit with that piece of advice for a little bit, which is keep those two goals in tension. What that means is that probably of all policy people I have worked with, scientists and technologists have the hardest time writing short memos. It is really hard because you are trying to get the detail down. So when I talk about having that 1 page, that 2 page, that paragraph level description of your idea, it is hard work to get that right. It is so much easier to write a 10-page memo. And I still, in my current context where I advise a lot of folks on policy, read policy memos every day. I will be writing a policy memo after we get off of this. And I know that it is easier to write long. So practice that, find ways to get that simplicity and economy, but don't do it at the compromise of being misunderstood. And a lot of that goes into that sweet bluff at the top, that bottom line up front. If you can get that bottom line up front at the top of your memo right, you'll hook them. One last thing to say on this, just please don't do too much rhetoric. Get specific about your idea. Throat clearing about how important your thing is just gonna turn off the reader. These are usually incredibly busy people who are usually smarter than a lot of other people around you who are trying to read your memo. And they will see your throat clearing, your rhetoric for what it is, which is usually covering up a lack of specificity on what action it is you want to drive, okay? So this is another section in Dr. Holdren's Common Pitfalls document. It's funny, if you haven't read it yet, you should, because he'll both tell you to use an Oxford comma in the same document as he will tell you to understand your intended audience. So there's a real mix in that document of copy editing advice and memo writing advice. So why do I sit for audience for a while? Generally, by the time you're writing a policy memo for an agency principal or the president, they're not new to the idea. They probably have some background. You should know what background they have. One of the first questions I would ask as a chief of staff is, when is the last time the president got a memo on this topic? Let me see it. Let me see the 4 times before that, so that I know what the background is going into this. You should also have a general sense of, is there going to be opposition or not, right? And do you need to sort of be strategic about how you bring the reader into thinking your idea is a good idea? Or is it already such a hook that they're going to be with you from the start? So have a sense of how much resistance do you expect to go into, and that will change the way you structure your memo. So again, you now know who your audience is. How much background do they need? If you just wrote the president a memo on the topic a year ago, they usually have a pretty good memory. They do not need you to repeat every fact. And there are things like appendices for a reason and footnotes. So just think about how much background you actually need to give. I often got copies of early draft policy memos from scientists that completely lacked evidence. It's like it's like backwards, right? We want scientists and technologists and those that exist in science and technology policy offices to be offering evidence. So please don't forget to give the justification for your idea. Strong citations, specific stats. There's almost nothing more powerful than including that if we did this, we would save this amount of money or this many lives. Or right now we're wasting this much money, or these many people are left out of the system. Those stats can be so powerful. I already said, please, please, please don't just admire the problem, offer actionable options, but I know in the work you're all doing, you are definitely developing great options. You know, don't be afraid of having an opinion about what the right option is, but do include other perspectives. If there is a path B that is just as valid as your path, offer it, because there could be good reasons why that's more politically achievable. Okay, why do I say here no surprises in red? So we're going to talk in a minute about the role of staff secretary and what it takes to get your policy ideas in front of an agency principal. And usually, whether you did your homework or not, other people are going to read your policy memo before your intended audience. So there will be somebody who says, you know what, so-and-so should really read this memo because they have an equity in the issue. And good chiefs of staff and good staff secretaries do not let policy ideas move forward unless everyone who has an equity in the issue, who has a stake in it, has a chance to provide comment. So you don't want to be surprised by their point of view. You want to already have talked with them, the people likely to be asked to read your memo. You want to already have asked them to provide input. So for example, if you sit in the White House and you're writing about a specific agency, that agency should not be surprised that you have written a memo about them. They should know, they should have given comment. So no surprises. By the time it actually gets delivered to the principal, please make sure that you've sought that input. Also, don't be afraid about acknowledging risks. If you're trying to do big things in the world, there are risks. You're going to get asked, what could go wrong? Feel free to do that. I can't, as somebody who worked for Dr. Holdren and who read every single memo he read before he did, I cannot skip saying how important proofreading is. I am sure that I missed a few typos in this presentation simply because I did this last night. So I feel silly even saying to you to proofread, proofread, proofread. But please use the preferred style guide, not your favorite style guide. So for example, when working for Dr. Holdren, you know that his preferred style guide is not only the White House style guide, but his own. He wrote a pitfalls document. So read the pitfalls document and follow it, right? So know what style guide you're writing to, not what your college or university told you to write to. What does the office you now are sitting in or writing for use? And follow their format, even if it sucks. Okay, last couple of points, and then I'd love to turn off the presentation and answer any questions you might have. One thing, even when I sat in the White House as a policy person, owning a policy portfolio, that I underappreciated until I became a chief of staff was the role of the staff secretary. The woman pictured next to President Obama here is Joni Walsh. She served as President Obama's staff secretary through the end of the administration. And her office, she is not just a person, she also led an office of the staff secretary, play a critical function in the White House of really taking care of the paper that moves to the president, whether it's paper in their briefing books or pieces of paper that he needs to sign or read or the like. And sometimes this role in a federal agency is distinct. Sometimes it sits with the chief of staff. Each agency has a function for how paper is reviewed. But Joni played a really important role, which was essentially if we had our policy memo from OSTP, we were ready to send to the president, which Dr. Holdren could do as an assistant to the president, send a memo directly up to the president. Joni's job was to take a look at it, or a member of Joni's team, and read for those equities that we talked about. For example, OSTP might have represented the science and technology community's view of artificial intelligence, but they might have failed to include the economic point of view from the National Economic Council, or the security point of view. Has the National Security Council been able to weigh in? And she would pick up the phone and she would ask for whether anyone with equities in that paper wanted a chance to take a look. So I think it's important to know that paper goes through a process, and almost never will your policy memo get to live without a lot of eyes on it if you really want it to make change. So get to know who it is in the structure of your organization who's responsible for moving that paper and ensuring that it has proper review. I could not respect the role of staff secretary more. It is something for you to take a look at. The fact that paper has a process, that ideas are paused so that everyone with an equity in the issue can review the paper, is a good thing for whether these policy ideas will be sound by the time they reach the president's desk. So maybe at some point in time, one of you is going to serve as staff secretary. Pretty darn cool job from my point of view. So I would love to take any questions. It can be about policy careers. It can be about writing policy memos. I have read every type of policy memo that you might imagine. I still, on a regular basis, read other people's policy memos, write my own, short, long, somewhere in between. And so I'm curious what questions you have for me. So I see a question in the chat. What additional challenges and differences do you see at the state and local levels and at the international level for science and technology policy writing? Great, great question. I think there are actually a lot of similarities at the state and local level, in which you have entrenched interests, you have a certain policy toolkit. I would say that the policy toolkit I described is pretty darn similar in that whether it's mayor or governor, they will have executive actions available to them. They will need to work with their partners, whether it's on a city council or in a state legislature. I think one of the differences in that has to do with where ideas are sourced. So from the federal agency, we might be looking at past federal action, or we might actually be stealing really good ideas that are happening in the states. It is interesting when you are writing at the local level to do a lot of friendly, well-intended idea stealing, meaning being very curious about what other jurisdictions have been doing and whether we could replicate those successes in our own community. Writing at an international level, I worked very closely. Dr. Holdren was in charge of a number of our bilateral and multilateral science engagements along with the State Department. And I would just note that there's a whole different strategy that goes into writing about policy change when you need to move governments that aren't your own. I think we can get into the deep end on that in a little bit if you'd like. I see a question in here about behavioral changes in regards to evidence. So one thing that I would say especially in science and technology policy, is that we often talk about research investments, so we're often talking about policy for science, and increasingly we are talking about science and technology for policy, so the ways in which science and technology can help policy outcomes in any issue of domestic or international policy. And so one thing that the Obama administration started for the social scientists in the room was something called a behavioral insights team, a social and behavioral sciences team. And thinking about the fact that so many of the big problems we face today, like for example, climate adaptation and resilience, require behavior. They require translation of research to practice. And they also require action by individuals, not just by governments. And so I think there's a really important role to play for behavioral insights and the way in which we leverage the social sciences to advance policy in a wide variety of areas. So Dominique, appreciate that question. Hope I answered it. I see a question from Kita that says, do you have tips for writing memos for aiding a process or an initiative, especially where there are no previous policy to which to refer? I think you might mean no previous policy memos. And in terms of aiding a process or initiative, you know, one of the things that I think is important to do if the process already exists or the initiative already exists is that you as a single person probably don't have all the answers about what needs to be done to make the process better. So often the first step we would use would be to run an interagency process or a 90-day review, or ask an independent commission to take a look-see and to seek input from a lot of parties. So for example, if we go back to this BRAIN initiative we were talking about, there are advisory councils that inform the NIH director about what should happen next now that we're a whole bunch of years into the administration of that initiative. What should the next focus areas be? What should change? And it's almost never a singular person's voice. So hope that is helpful and answers your question. Are there other questions you might have for me? Oh, they're coming. So I see a question here that says, how do you handle different perspectives that may be in antagonism with each other when writing a memo? Do you have concrete strategies when you have two different communities you have to address that may be in conflict with each other? Well, yeah. I mentioned that I didn't love conflict earlier in my career, and that now I relish the process of, you know, working through those differences of views. You know, I think one thing that made science and technology policy particularly interesting is that even within our own office, we had differences of views. So we had scientists that came at certain technology areas as from the perspective of innovation. If we invested in automated technologies, in drones, we could see the following types of entrepreneurial innovation in the country create jobs and industries of the future. At the same time, we had people in our office who looked at those capabilities from a national security perspective. Those automated technologies could be deployed by those whose interests are not in the interest of our country to exploit, to take advantage of, to XYZ. At the same time, as we had other policy professionals who came at it from a privacy and security of the American people, not just of the country, right? So are we sufficiently protecting the information of the public? And we had people who came at it from the perspective of equity and inclusion. There is bias built into automated technologies that we need to address. The people that are building automated technologies do not reflect the diversity of our country. And that was actually fantastic to have those points of view in tension, because it really, if there was a sufficient process, allowed for some pathways to be identified that kept all of those interests in appropriate tension, that sort of attended to each of them without one being left out. And this is one of the reasons why going around a staff secretary process or going around an established procedure can be so harmful, because you leave those views out. I think one more thing I would say about that is there are standard processes in the White House environment for working through differences of views. The Office of Science and Technology Policy runs something called the National Science and Technology Council, which is an interagency policy-making body. It's often used to write reports, but it has the authority to create policy recommendations. And the idea there is to seek views from the agencies that might be in tension with each other about where to go. Similarly, the National Security Council, NSC, runs principal deputy processes, which means that first you start down at the agency staff level, you get a whole bunch of agency staff together, they work through some tensions and the hard points in a recommendation, they kick that up, the questions they can't resolve, they kick up those hard questions to agency deputies. The deputies wrestle with each other. the questions that the deputies can't resolve or the disagreements that they can't resolve get kicked up to agency principals. They try to resolve it, and if they can't resolve it, the president resolves it. And so having that escalation of the hardest questions is part of how the government is structured. At the end of the day, sometimes there are those split views. So in the memo context, we basically, in the recommendation section, had already stated forth the options and would literally offer, usually at the White House component level, OSTP's view is blank. NSC's view is blank. And it would be that straightforward. And usually when we would send something like that to the president, the next thing that would happen would be a meeting. We should actually talk about why we have that difference of views. It's funny, I didn't read Albert's bonus question after that, but I think I actually just got to Albert's bonus question about escalation dominance. I actually missed one aspect of it though. So what do I mean by escalation dominance? It sounds like some terrible war strategy. It's not meant to be as aggressive as it sounds, but sometimes it's important to know if your boss has more influence over a certain issue than someone else's boss. So hierarchy exists for a reason, and in the federal government, sometimes you can say, if you are at a sticking point, I think your boss should talk to my boss. And it's important to know if you have escalation dominance over the person you are suggesting that to, then or not. And that usually helps you figure out how you're going to resolve that issue. So do you have advice for writing memos from outside of government offices, like an advocacy organization, compared to writing for a government official while on their staff? So I do that now. So I work for an association that advocates for science engagement. We write memos on a regular basis. I would say like 95% of the rules still apply. You might need to do a little more throat clearing. You know, I hate throat clearing. I've said that already. But usually you need to do a little bit of stage setting. Why is the problem important? Who are you? Why should they listen to you? And that part at the top provides the context that the government actor needs to determine, do they care about your opinion or not? I think the other thing that I would note is a difference from outside of government is this idea about sort of coalition building. So a lot of time and energy I will put into working with other organizations to sign on to these things with me. So it's not just about me writing the memo of what I want my elected officials to do. It is also about me showing that I am not alone. So we have a formal process around getting sign-ons and showing that we are a coalition, and that would be another big difference. Rachel, in your question. Sarah asks whether we can talk more about the incentives of policies beyond carrots and sticks or hierarchical and economic. How do you think collaborative policy can be enhanced? I actually think that and this might not be what you mean, Sarah, but I have a particular thing I would love to work on if and when I go back in government, which is that I actually think we underutilize public participation in policy development. So I'm very, very interested in open innovation generally. I am curious about how we change public comment, how we change how the public can, as an informed public, participate in the policy-making process, how they can comment on potential regulation, how we change requests for information. Often I think the people who read the Federal Register come from a certain point of view. They read the Federal Register. That's not all of America. So what can we actually do to make that collaborative process, that open process, actually participatory? I'm a little bit of a nerd for working for that. So I think that's it. I want to just say in my last minute or so, the question here with Laura about pursuing a career in science policy. I think that some of the most important things about that have to do with being a good networker And the other thing I would say is being willing to, and by the way, anyone can be a good networker. I'm an introvert. I don't like going to networking events, but I am intentional about building relationships. And my last comment on that would be being willing to take leaps. The science community does not sufficiently value career pathways that go outside of the norm, and we should change that. But when you make a leap that puts you into a policy pathway or a science communication pathway, it will feel risky. When I took a leap to move across the country and work for White House OSTP, it felt super risky, and it was the best job I ever had. So it for sure is worth the risk. Don't worry about taking the leap. I can't wait to see what results from your policy memos, and please feel free to be in touch if there's anything that you need. You can always reach me on Twitter as well. And thank you very much for the time you spent with me on this Saturday morning.
Thank you so much, Cristin, for all of your knowledge and your expertise that you offered. I would love to give you a virtual round of applause if you guys can with your icon or your reaction icons. So thank you so much for this. So we'll now move on to Adriana's talk. Dr. Adriana Bankston is a principal legislative analyst in the University of California's Office of Federal Government Relations, where she serves as an advocate for UC with Congress, the administration, as well as federal agencies. Prior to this position, Adriana was a policy and advocacy fellow at the Society for Neuroscience, where she provided staff support for special and ongoing projects, including SFN's annual lobby event and the Society's annual meeting. In addition to working at UC, Adriana also serves as co-director at the Policy Task Force at Future of Research and is Chief Outreach Officer at the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. Adriana obtained her PhD in biochemistry, cell and developmental biology from Emory University, and her bachelor's in biological sciences from Clemson University. So we'll now open the floor for Adriana to give her talk on the structure and the format of policy memos.
Great, thank you, Paige. So it was really inspiring to hear from Cristin. Thank you for providing a great introduction to this talk, which will be more focused on principles of memo writing. So I'll try to reinforce some of the concepts that Cristin brought up and show you a few examples as well. So thank you for having me here. I want to just start by talking about how to address non-scientific audiences in a broader sense. So you've probably seen this diagram before. You know that academic writing is very much starting with the background, followed by supporting details, results, and conclusions. And policy writing, as Cristin said, also starts with the bottom line, answers the question, so what? Why do I care? And then adds supporting details. So this is essentially a flipped argument from the academic way of writing. The first question to ask yourself when addressing non-scientific audiences is who is your audience, but in a larger context. This includes being aware of which current issues are being debated, who is engaging in them, so knowing the political landscape, how you can frame actionable solutions to problems that your audience might have, and also framing these based on constituency. The second is, what message do you want to send to your particular audience? This should be accessible, relatable, and meaningful, and clearly answer the question of why should I care? And finally, the medium. So you would communicate your message differently while speaking versus writing. So what is the most effective way to communicate your message to your audience? Again, emphasizing here that this is your message to your audience, so it will be very specific to your particular situation. So I can tell you from my role at UC and others that I've had that about 85% of policy work is writing. So these are important principles to learn here. So when writing policy, you want to use active verbs, which convey a certain tone of leadership and responsibility, as well as use analogies and examples to better relate to your audience. You want to avoid jargon, euphemisms, cliches, wordplays, and puns. You want to only include details that are critical to your story, and we'll get to this a little bit later. You want to keep your story true to the facts and have it be evidence-based. And be prepared to revise, rewrite your work and cite your sources. So the only way that you'll develop your policy writing skills is to practice. So expect a lot of drafts in the process, especially for scientists like myself, and as Cristin said, who transitioned from academia to policy, and we're not used to writing in this very brief, concise way. So it will take a lot of drafts to do that. So in terms of the types of writing, you can see, I just want to show you all the different examples of policy pieces that you can write. This is from the JSPG editorial guidelines. So you'll see here that there are many types of write-ups. They vary in length from 2,000 words to 6 to 8 pages. They have different purposes. Some of them have policy recommendations, but not all. And there are also other differences. For example, not all of these make a one-sided argument. Some are more balanced. Op-eds are sort of on the one spectrum of this, and some of the others are in the middle or will present both views. So in this presentation, we'll focus on memos which provide analysis and recommendations for a particular audience regarding a particular solution or problem. So it will be important to define the problem and who it's addressed to. And as you can see here, memos should be short and concise, maximum 2,000 words. So we'll be reiterating this concept again. So let's start with some basics on policy memos, which are typically written by policy advisors, advocates, or everyday citizens seeking to affect change in their community. Their purpose is to be their straightforward documents, concise documents that analyze an issue and offer recommendations to inform and guide a decision maker. So readers usually have a finite amount of time to read your memo. So a concise and straightforward presentation of information is essential. And memos aim to communicate essential information to decision makers quickly and clearly. And they can serve as vehicles to persuade the readers to act on a particular issue in a certain way. And they're written usually for uninformed but intelligent readers, not necessarily policy wonks. So much of the time, readers of policy memos include, but are not limited to, politicians, lobbyists, non-governmental organizations, community leaders, and public initiatives. In addition to these concepts, let's also talk about other dimensions to consider in writing effective policy memos. And Cristin touched upon some of these already. So you want to ask yourself, first of all, why are you writing this? What is the justification and the need that the memo is filling? Whom do you represent? Who are you writing this as? As well as in a larger context, you should do your research on what prior legislation looks like on this topic and whether what you propose has been done before. Think about how funding should be allocated to accomplish your recommendations if this is part of the memo. And more broadly, again, what is the political context under which you're writing this? So thinking about these factors beforehand will make it more likely that your memo will achieve the goals that you want it to. The structure, which I'm showing on the right here, is also critical to the success of the memo, especially in terms of clarity and conciseness. So the structure is important as you consider the factors that have been outlined so far in the presentation. By starting with the bottom line up front, you can present your takeaway message right at the top. This will be followed by a relevant and concise background. So this is key. You don't want to give all the background that you have. You only want to give what is needed in order to bring them up to speed as briefly as possible. And by explaining what the issue is and the significance of the issue to the reader. So the more direct the significance is, the more effective the memo will be. Next, you need to define the argument through relevant dimensions. So in addition to this being evidence-based, there are also other dimensions that should be taken into consideration, and we will cover these a little later. It is also important that you not only state your recommendations and that they're clear, but that you provide a specific blueprint and policy roadmap that you want to use for implementing them. So continuing with this idea of having a straightforward strategy for policy implementation, there are also additional considerations for an effective memo. It should have a neutral and straightforward tone. You should use active voice, which suggests an ongoing problem and conveys a sense of urgency. Your memo should be brief so that the reader can understand the main points quickly. It should be objective, so you need to show both the positive and negative outcomes of your proposed policy recommendations. The audience should be able to clearly understand how the information that you present can be translatable into concrete policy decisions. It should be concise. Your argument needs to be succinct without unnecessary details. And it needs to be substantiated by credible findings and evidence. And finally, you should consider the political palatability, because policy memos often pertain to political issues, so it's important to consider the political positions of your readers and how those individuals might respond to your recommendations. Okay. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples. So you'll remember that memos, as I said, are typically directed towards individuals, organizations, and particular decision makers. This one refers to recommendations made to the NIH. And as the structure, as I said, usually there's a summary at the top following a structure of what do we know, what do we recommend, and what the limitations of the study are, as well as barriers to the policy that you want to implement, and then conclusions. So this is, I'm just showing you here the executive summary of the memo, not the whole paper, but I think this will still be useful for illustrating some concepts from a more academic style memo. So the background here in red is that animals have served as a long-standing model for biomedical research, and animal experimentation is justified as a means towards informing human health. The context in gray is that actually there's a lack of predictive utility of animal models for human disease, as well as the therapeutic response and toxicity being issues with this approach. The argument, which is shown in teal, is that 90% of the work in animals does not translate to humans, and there's a lot of variation among animal models, so this argument would support alternatives to using animal models. Therefore, the recommendations that are made, shown in blue, are that NIH should expand efforts to improve translatability of preclinical research by establishing the Model Human Initiative. The justification, shown in orange, for this particular recommendation is that it promotes the development of innovative technologies to supplant animal models. It fosters the growth of university infrastructure, etc. So after this argument, you would typically have a section discussing the limitations and barriers to implementing these recommendations, as well as conclusions. So this is a different kind of memo, which is more similar to what I see every day. This is an example that you would be writing to a leader within your university. So in this case, we're talking about University of Utah, but the same format can be applied to memos being written within any organization. And you can see that this looks different from the more academic style that I showed you previously. However, I think the academic type of writing can really teach you how to write something like this, because you can learn how to write each section really well and adapt it to something like this. So for simplicity, I'll go through this using the same structure. So you'll notice that this is one page, so you don't want to go beyond 1.5 pages. The spacing and font make it easy to read and visually pleasing. It's not overcrowded. And the structure is very simple. It has a header, background section, context, and then recommendations made to the university. And then in the next couple of slides, I'll break this down a little bit, but I want to show you the whole structure in this slide first. So I like this example because it's easy to understand and it's straightforward. So in the header section, this is what you typically see, to, from, date, and subject. Note that this is internal within the University of Utah and directed to multiple specific individuals. So you can see the bottom line first, which is the request that the Masters of Philosophy be added to the list of degrees that are offered at the university in several disciplines. The background, which is in red, again, is relevant to this bottom line. So it only shows what the person needs to know to support this. Again, it's very brief and direct. The argument that would support this, again, in teal for moving forward with adopting this bottom line is that it will not create more work or much change, meaning no new courses. It's not a new curriculum, does not lead to new programs. So addressing the potential limitations of this adoption is also very useful here. The context and actually the justification in orange for this adoption is that the graduate school has already been authorized by the State Board of Regents to add this degree to various departments at the university. So after this context setting, the recommendations that are being made, or really the asks in this case, are that the degree be offered in the departments that are listed here at the University of Utah. And then it ends with an official address and additional contact information at the bottom. So it's very clear, succinct, and straightforward and professional in this format as well. And I think it's very easy to understand the structure based on what they're laying out. So now that you know the basics of memo writing, I want to talk a little bit about other dimensions to consider when you're framing your argument and recommendations. Okay. The first thing to consider is having explicit transparency. So this means being straightforward about the limitations of your recommendations and also thinking about the criteria that you will use to address the likelihood for success or failure of your recommendations. This transparency can be based on an initial cost-benefit analysis, which is a summary analysis of the costs and benefits of each recommendation. This analysis can provide useful criteria to assess the likelihood of success and failure of your recommendations. And this can also be useful when you're summarizing the key differences between your recommendations and alternative policy options, as well as stating why yours is better than others. And then finally, the cost-benefit analysis can also help you assess the practicality and feasibility of your recommendations. The next consideration is doing a stakeholder analysis, where you assess the impact of your recommendations on various stakeholders in the community. And also you need to keep in mind the views of major political players in relation to your recommendations. So would they be for, would they be against them? And how would you frame these recommendations within the current political context and how these players would react? Next is the social impact analysis, which refers to examining the broader social consequences of your proposed recommendations. For the most part, you need to be able to explain how your recommendations will actually address the problem at hand and what the broader implications are. This will entail having very concrete suggestions and, again, being able to explain why one option is better than another as it relates to societal impacts. In addition to these broader considerations, you also need to think about the feasibility of your recommendations in several contexts. This includes whether they're politically feasible, operationally feasible, as well as financially feasible. So it's okay if your recommendations are different or maybe considered radical to an extent, but they must be realistic as well as doable based on these criteria, and again, with a broader political context in mind. So we don't want to end this presentation without addressing the idea of inclusive communication, which also applies to policy memo writing. So among the things to do are using people-centric language. So this focuses on the person and reflects on their individuality. So it does not classify or stereotype the person based on their association or identity with a certain group or culture. You should also consider a strength-based approach, which means focusing on the abilities, knowledge, and capacities of people and assuming positive things, rather than a deficit approach as it related to individuals. You also want to use terms that are defined by the community, which you can find after doing some research. And you want to write for a global audience, again, keeping in mind the broader applicability and accessibility of your writing. and not being, for example, too culturally sensitive to the US only. So on the flip side, you don't want to use any language that shows prejudice, stereotyped, or discriminatory views of particular people or groups. You also don't want to write with unnecessary gendered language. So you don't want to assign particular genders to a person or assuming that a specific task is only limited to one gender. One example of this would be, instead of saying mailman, you can say mail carrier, for example, and others. Pronouns can also go here in terms of not using gendered specific pronouns unless the person you're referring to is actually that gender. And then you don't want to employ socially charged terms for technical concepts. So what do I mean by that? So you want to avoid referring to people in divisive ways. For example, avoid terms such as native as a native speaker, first class as in first class citizen, even though these may be widely used terms. So instead of saying native, you could say built in to describe a feature that's part of a product. Instead of first class, you could refer to it as something that is essential or part of a core of a product, for example. These are just a couple of examples here. And finally, you don't want to apply ableist language, which are common things that we may be inclined to say without realizing it. Ableism is defined as a systematic institutional devaluing of bodies and minds, which are deemed deviant, abnormal, defective, subhuman, less than, etc. This includes words like crazy, insane, crippled, dumb, and others. So one example is instead of saying something like give everything a final sanity check, you could say give everything a final check for completeness and clarity. So these are just a few of the principles to keep in mind. I have a bunch of resources here just to reiterate, including the John Holdren resource, and a few related to inclusive communication as well. And there are a lot of other principles, but I didn't want to go through too much today, just to give you kind of the basics here. A lot of these I've used myself in writing. Some of them are memo specific, other ones are just useful for writing policy. And a lot of them I also use today in the slides. And I'm happy to share these slides as well afterwards. And finally, this is my contact. So feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to talk to you more about memo writing. Thank you.
All right, feel free to, Adriana, that was an incredible presentation. Thank you so much for breaking down all of the concepts on memo writing. If you guys have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or you can use the hand raising option and we'll call on you. So I think Ali Villegas has her hand raised, or his hand raised. Sorry if I mispronounced your pronouns. You can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask. Or actually, no, I think that was just hand clapping, sorry. Okay, we have a few questions in the chat. One from Denise Colberly, who says, could you discuss more about how audience analysis works in policy writing?
Yeah, I think what I would say about this is that keeping sort of in mind the broader context of who you're writing it to and sort of their prior interest, doing your research on what, as I said, what prior legislation has existed, what their views might be. And this is something that we're discussing recently, that there is not really a central place to find this information, but you'd have to do research on sort of what the interest of your audience is, what they've done in the past. Again, a lot of this will be either on certain websites or social media. It's really will require doing a lot of research and also looking at prior documents as well. So it depends a lot on who you're talking to, but generally looking at prior interests that they've had and things that they've engaged in would be helpful, especially for policymakers, which you can find. Talking to the public, I think, is a different story, but it's, you know, it's sort of doing your homework before you work on your write-up to make sure that what you're saying is hasn't been done, and again, where you fit in kind of in that large context. So there's a question from Valentina: clarify the difference between argument and justification. So I think argument in my mind can be sort of both sides. Essentially, this would be sort of the way you're backing up your recommendations. Justification is you're actually using that to back up what you're saying. So argument, I think, can have more of a nuanced way of thinking about this, that you actually could present both sides of the story, whether your recommendation is good or bad, where it's likely to succeed or not, whereas justification has a very positive nuance to it. That's actually only one facet of that, if that makes sense. Okay, question from Josh. What are some best practices for balancing making enthusiastic recommendations while maintaining an objective stance? Can we integrate strong calls to action? Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up. So I think there is definitely a balance between, I think, and Cristin kind of touched upon this, you want to get people engaged in your vision and kind of going along with your idea and being part of something broader than just what you're writing. Part of this will be obviously making sure that your writing is backed up by specific evidence, but there is sort of this other side of, you know, how do we get people engaged in this vision? I think the call to action, that's definitely something that should be part of this. I think it'll depend, again, on the kind of memo you're writing and who it's for. You'll definitely have some sort of ask or recommendation. So the example that I showed with including the Masters of Philosophy in the university, that's a pretty strong ask, but doesn't really have a call to action, so to speak. So if you want to engage a larger group, I think you can have the sort of at the very end, or when you're kind of promoting your idea, including call to action, potentially to different audiences as well, depending on what you're writing for. Okay, question from Sarah. How and where in the policy memo structure can we add an iterative item? Okay. Okay, I think adding, so iteration, I think, is a good principle to an extent, in that it'll help you emphasize your idea if you can say it over and over again. And there's different ways to state that, right? So you can put the bottom line first, you can say the same thing again later in a different way and multiple times across to kind of keep people engaged, but keeping in mind that this is also a very short and concise write-up, so you don't want to go into too much detail. But I do think iteration, I think, is helpful to kind of do throughout the process. You can kind of give that a, do it at the beginning very concisely, and then say it again in your background, say it again at the end. I think it'll kind of become more apparent once you start working on the memo where that will be, but I think that can be it can be a useful tactic for reinforcing your point, but also keep in mind that it needs to be brief as well.
So I have a quick question about cost-benefit analysis. So many of us probably don't have a lot of experience with budgets or figuring out, how to put together something along those lines. So do you have any suggestions for getting some experience in being able to apply that to your policy memo?
Yeah, honestly, I think a lot of it comes with practice. So depending on where you are, I guess. So in my role too, it's sort of like going to the person who's done it before and seeing what it is. I mean, some of it comes down to kind of pros and cons and thinking about both sides of your recommendation, making sure that you know what the opposition might say to your recommendation. I'd have to look up more, and I think there's a lot of resources online about how to actually conduct this. I haven't done it myself, but I think that's the other advice to give, I guess, is talk to somebody who's done it before and can tell you more about the principles. But again, considering also kind of both sides of your recommendations. Okay, so Cristin is saying, in response to Josh, the outcome-based goals that can be issued about implementing the policy idea, we could call to double X by Y, which would result in Z, or we could eliminate the waiting list for Z by Y, saying X amount of money, and then offering the rationale for that goal within the memo. Yeah, thank you for those examples. That's really helpful.
All right. Thank you so much, Adriana, for your expertise. Also, thank you, Cristin, for your expertise.